The day had begun before the sun's first gold touched the horizon. She rose with a weary sigh, the weight of another endless day already pressing against her chest. Her small farmhouse creaked with silence, echoing only her footsteps as she moved from room to room. The floors, worn by years of labor, shone faintly from her constant scrubbing. She did not allow herself to rest. Rest, to her, felt like weakness, and weakness was something she had sworn never to show. She lit the stove, set water to boil, and moved on to the next task before the first one was finished. Her hands, red and rough, were proof of the countless mornings and nights she had worked until her body could do no more. The world outside her window stretched wide and lonely, fields of dry grass waving under the wind, the fences leaning as though begging to be fixed, the barn door barely hanging by its hinges. Everything seemed to demand something from her, and she gave, always gave, until there was nothing left. By noon the sun had grown merciless, hanging high like a burning eye in the sky. She had been carrying buckets from the well, each one heavier than the last. Sweat dripped down her temples, staining the collar of her faded dress. Her muscles trembled, but she told herself she could do one more trip, just one more. Her breath grew short, her vision blurred at the edges, yet she kept walking, kept working. She could not stop. Stopping meant remembering how alone she was, and that pain was heavier than any bucket of water. Her knees buckled suddenly. The bucket slipped from her grasp, water spilling into the thirsty dirt. She tried to steady herself, but the ground tilted and spun, and before she could cry out, her body crumpled into the dust. The world dimmed around her, her heartbeat thundering in her ears until it faded into silence. Fate had other plans for her that day. A cowboy, riding his horse along the edge of her property, had noticed the figure in the distance. He thought at first it was nothing more than a shadow bending in the heat, but then he saw her fall. His heart lurched. Without hesitation, he urged his horse forward, hooves pounding against the earth. When he reached her, the sight struck him still, her body limp, her skin pale beneath the flush of fever, strands of hair stuck to her damp forehead. He dismounted in a rush, kneeling beside her. His calloused hand brushed against her cheek, and he felt the searing heat of her skin. "Ma'am." His voice was low but urgent. "Can you hear me?" She stirred faintly, lips parting as though to form words, but only a whisper escaped. He leaned close, catching fragments of sound, something like "Don't leave me," though he wasn't sure. With careful strength, he slipped his arms beneath her and lifted her against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, far too light, as though hard work had carved away more than just her strength. He carried her inside her farmhouse, the door creaking open under his push. The room smelled of wood smoke and faint lavender, yet the air was heavy, stale from disuse. He laid her gently on the sofa, removing his hat and setting it aside. For a moment, he simply looked at her, at the stubborn lines of her face even in unconsciousness, at the tension in her hands that even fever could not unclench. She was a woman who had fought battles unseen, and she was losing. He moved quickly then. He found a basin, filled it with water from the well, and returned with a damp cloth. Kneeling, he placed it across her forehead, brushing away damp strands of hair. She flinched faintly but did not wake. Her breath came shallow, her chest rising and falling with fragile rhythm. The hours passed slowly. He stayed by her side, cooling her fever, fanning her with an old scrap of cardboard he found on the table, coaxing her lips to accept a trickle of water when she stirred. Sometimes she murmured broken words, fragments of thoughts spilling into the air, apologies, pleas, memories. Each time, his hand tightened gently around hers, steadying her as if to anchor her against the storm inside. Night settled in. The cicadas outside sang their endless chorus, and the wind rattled the shutters. He lit a lantern, its glow casting shadows across the walls, and sat back in the chair beside her. His eyes never left her face. He thought of the strength it must have taken to work until her body collapsed, of the loneliness it must mean to have no one there to stop her, no one to say rest. Something stirred inside him, a tenderness he had buried long ago, a promise he hadn't expected to make. He wasn't sure why he felt it, but he knew one thing with certainty: he would not leave her. Not tonight. Not while she fought this fever alone. As dawn whispered at the edges of the sky, he was still there, watchful and steadfast, a silent guardian over a woman who had given everything until there was nothing left. For the first time in years, she was no longer alone in her struggle. And for the first time in years, he felt as though his wandering had led him exactly where he was meant to be. The morning broke soft and golden, sunlight spilling across the farmhouse floor in slanted beams. She stirred beneath its warmth, her eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, confusion clouded her thoughts. Where was she? Why did her body feel so heavy, yet strangely light at the same time? Then her gaze settled on the figure slumped in the chair beside her. The cowboy. His hat rested on the table, his head tilted forward in sleep, his arms folded across his chest. He had stayed. All through the night, he had remained by her side. A strange mix of gratitude and embarrassment swelled inside her. She had prided herself for so long on standing alone, on never needing anyone. Yet here she was, weak and helpless, with a stranger watching over her. She tried to sit up, but the effort made her dizzy, and a soft groan escaped her lips. His eyes snapped open instantly. "You're awake," he said, his voice rough with sleep yet warm with relief. He rose quickly and steadied her with a hand on her shoulder. "Careful now. Don't push yourself too hard." "I don't need," she began, but the words faltered as another wave of weakness pulled at her. Her pride wanted to send him away, but her body betrayed her. "You don't have to need it," he replied gently. "You deserve it." The words stilled her. She had not heard kindness spoken so plainly in years, maybe ever. She lowered her eyes, unable to meet his steady gaze. He fetched her a cup of water, held it to her lips, and she sipped slowly, the coolness soothing her parched throat. Over the next few days, he remained. She protested at first, insisting she would manage, but each time he found something to do, mending the broken latch on the barn door, splitting wood for the stove, sweeping the porch where dust had gathered. He cooked simple meals in her kitchen, the smell of cornbread filling the air, and though she muttered about not needing anyone, she ate every bite. Her fever broke, and slowly her strength returned, but something else was happening too. In the quiet evenings, as the sky burned orange and the fields shimmered in fading light, they talked. He told her stories of the trail, of nights beneath endless stars, of the loneliness that came with wandering. His voice carried a quiet weight, a man who had seen too much yet kept his heart steady. She listened, at first silently, then with questions, then with her own truths spilling out. She told him of her life, of years spent holding everything together alone. She confessed how she filled her days with work not just out of necessity but to keep the silence at bay, to drown the ache of emptiness. He listened without judgment, his eyes never leaving hers. For the first time, she felt her words weren't falling into a void, they were being caught, held, understood. As her laughter returned, soft, hesitant at first, then freer, he found himself smiling more than he had in years. Each sound of her joy felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. He began to look at her differently, not just as a woman who had collapsed from exhaustion, but as someone who had built a fortress around herself, brick by brick, and who was now slowly opening its gate. One evening, after a day of light chores and shared meals, she turned to him suddenly. "You've done enough," she said, her voice trembling. "You should go." He studied her for a long moment, his jaw tightening, his eyes steady. "I'll go," he said softly, "when you truly don't need me anymore. Not a day before." Her throat tightened, and she looked away. The old fear rose inside her, the fear of needing, of leaning, of finding herself abandoned again. But his words lingered, echoing in the quiet of her heart. That night, when the crickets sang and the lantern flickered low, she sat beside him. Her body was still weak, her hands still trembling from the remnants of illness, but she let her head rest against his shoulder. He stilled for a moment, surprised, then wrapped his arm around her, holding her with a gentleness that felt like strength. They sat in silence, two souls who had lived too long apart from tenderness, now finding it in the most unexpected way. The fever had passed, but something deeper had begun to bloom: trust, care, and the fragile beginnings of love. She was no longer the woman who collapsed alone in the dust. She was the woman who had finally allowed herself to be lifted, to be cared for, and in that surrender, she found a strength far greater than she had ever known. And he, once a wanderer with no home but the trail, realized that perhaps he had found the place his heart had been searching for all along. The night held them quietly, and the world outside seemed softer, as though it too knew that something had changed forever. The days turned into weeks, and with every sunrise, her strength returned little by little. She no longer looked like the fragile shadow that had collapsed in the dust. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her steps, though cautious, grew firmer with each passing day. But something else had changed too, something deeper than her body's recovery. Her farmhouse, once silent and heavy with loneliness, now carried the soft hum of companionship. The cowboy's presence had filled it with warmth. His boots by the door, his laughter mingling with hers, the quiet rhythm of his voice telling stories at night, all of it wove a new kind of life into the old wooden walls. At first, she told herself it was temporary. He would leave soon. Men like him never stayed. But each time she tried to imagine him gone, her chest tightened. The thought of returning to endless silence felt unbearable now. She caught herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the way he repaired the broken hinges on the barn door, the way he spoke to his horse with patience, the way his eyes softened when they met hers. She had built her life on pride, on independence, on the belief that needing someone meant weakness. But now she began to wonder if true strength was allowing herself to be cared for. One evening, the sky bled into shades of purple and gold, and they sat together on the porch. The air was cool, carrying the scent of earth and wildflowers. He leaned back in his chair, his hat tilted low, while she folded her hands in her lap, struggling with words she had never dared to speak. "You've been here a long while," she said finally, her voice low. He looked at her, one brow raised. "Does it trouble you?" Her heart thudded. "No. It troubles me that someday you'll ride away." He studied her, his gaze steady and unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the chorus of crickets rising with the dusk. Then he said softly, "I've been wandering for years. Every trail led to nowhere. But here," he gestured toward her, toward the farmhouse, toward the life she had kept alive with her own two hands. "Here feels different." She swallowed hard. Her instinct was to retreat, to guard herself. But the truth pressed against her lips, aching to be free. "I don't want you to leave," she whispered. The admission felt like tearing down the last wall she had built around her heart. Her chest ached with it, but at the same time, a strange relief spread through her veins. His hand reached across the space between them, rough fingers brushing against hers. She did not pull away this time. He held her hand gently, as though it were the most precious thing he had ever touched. "You've spent too long carrying the world on your own," he said. "Let me carry some of it with you." Her eyes stung, though she fought back the tears. No one had ever offered her such words. No one had ever looked at her and seen not just her strength, but her weariness too. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to lean, to accept, to believe. The days that followed were filled with small, quiet changes. He began fixing the roof, one plank at a time. She found herself cooking more than she ever had before, setting 2 plates at the table instead of 1. They worked side by side, sometimes in silence, sometimes with easy laughter. Slowly, the hollow emptiness that had haunted her farmhouse began to vanish. One night, after supper, he stood by the fire, the light casting a glow across his weathered face. "I came here by chance," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But I reckon it wasn't chance at all. Maybe I was meant to find you." She stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "And maybe I was meant to fall," she answered softly, so someone would be there to lift me. The silence that followed was not empty but full of unspoken promises, full of something stronger than words. He turned toward her then, and in the firelight, their eyes met, not as strangers, not even as friends, but as two souls who had carried too much alone and had finally found a place to rest. That night, the farmhouse was no longer just hers. It was theirs. The woman who had once collapsed in the dust, alone and fevered, had risen again, not only because her body healed, but because her heart had finally allowed itself to be seen, to be cared for, to be loved. And the cowboy, once a wanderer with no place to belong, had found his home, not in the walls of the farmhouse, but in her, in the quiet strength of the woman who had fought so hard against loneliness until she could fight no more. The story ended not with grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but with something far greater: two lives, once broken and solitary, now bound together in the quiet certainty that they were no longer alone.